If you take a hull of any size, be it a great ship or a wooden shoe, and just set it into the water, the stream is going to lead it wherever it damn well pleases. The problem is that you're probably putting yourself on a boat not to go with the flow, but with a very specific destination in mind. You need some way to steer the ship where you want it to go. Everyone knows of the ship's wheel. It is a relatively new invention, not appearing until the rump end of the Age of Pirates. Throughout history, there existed many steering mechanisms, along with tactics and methods involved in the practice. Let's set a course and do a deep dive.
There is something which I am very excited to show you, crew and company. An exclusive brass coin featuring the channel logo and a compass from a period map. It looks unbelievable, but in order to make it happen, I need help from at least 300 of you. In the video description or pinned comment below, you'll find a link where you can add it to your wishlist, complete it for free, and on the 28th of August you can then pledge $1 to lock in your coin. And when the 300 goal has been met, a final $25 for production and shipping will be charged, and we'll kick into gear. To sweeten the deal, the first 300 backers on the 28th will also get a custom leather display case, free of charge. I'm very excited to see what you guys think about this item, because we're not only making a coin here, but testing the waters on how interested you guys are in Gold Gunpowder products. To let you in on a little secret, we are currently in pre-production on a fully illustrated book about pirate ships. But before we can launch, we need to know if you guys are interested. So get into the video description, click that link, and add it to your wishlist. If you do so now, there might also be a little secret waiting for you.
The most ancient method of steering a vessel is the humble paddle. It could come in the form of a simple board, an oar, or even just a typical paddle. The normal kind used to propel the vessel along the sides, or it could be oversized and specifically shaped to direct the flow of water, and thus the direction of the vessel. The way it works is that it redirects the flow of water past the hull, thus making the entire vessel turn. It was arduous work. In a canoe, the steersman had to balance on the edge of the stern, grasping the paddle with one hand at the top of the shaft, and one at the loom just above the blade. He would have to use his hip, or the stern itself as a pivot point, critical in surf or swift waters. One sailor remarked how he used all his strength to make it work, just barely. This method of steering vessels was the nominal method in the New World, up until the arrival of the Europeans. It is how Native Americans across the continent steered their canoes, well into the modern period. Elsewhere in the world, the steering oar had been fastened to the vessel itself. This dates as far back as ancient Egypt. It was typically fastened on the right side of the vessel, which is why this side is called starboard, stemming from an Old English term meaning steering side. The reason why the board was fastened on this side is probably because most people are right-handed. An alternate method, seen on various barges, rivercraft, but also Caribbean piraguas, large canoes, is using a very long steering oar mounted on the middle of the transom or end of the boat between two oarlocks. These steering oars are very long so as to increase leverage and ease steering. The base is wider in order to increase its effect on the water flow. It is a sort of middle point between the steering oar and rudder. In Europe, the mounted steering oar evolved in the early Middle Ages into the rudder, a tall, vertically mounted board. Owing to its effectiveness, this basic device remains in use today, although it has changed in many ways which might appear subtle, but had a significant impact. Nor was the rudder without its issues, as slight changes in its design could change how the vessel handled. Rudders could be deployed on rowboats and the humble canoe, but were most notably mounted aboard large ships. A canoe rudder isn't much smaller in relation to the craft, whereas the size comparison between a ship and its rudder is more significant, and it seems strange that such a tiny device could control the entire vessel. It does help that water is 770 times denser than air, and that the rudder, by being positioned at the pivot point of the ship's center, exerts the greatest possible turning moment. It essentially functions like a large lever. It is much easier to pull at its end than at its base. The rudder turns the ship by redirecting the flow of water past the hull, and is, therefore, dependent on the flow of water. Therefore, it can only work if the ship has significant headway or sternway,
moving forward or backward, creating said water flow. A ship cannot turn starboard or larboard if it is moving too slowly or standing completely still. So when maneuvering a ship in a port or harbor, it was common to use oars or tow the ship behind smaller boats. When propellers were added to boats in the 19th century, they would act upon the rudder and create various problems which are not exactly relevant to this video. Anyway, this means that the rudder on a sail ship was safe and predictable, but also limiting. Since the rudder was dependent on the flow of water, the turning ability was dependent on the speed of the ship. A higher speed allowed you to turn more quickly. However, in a lot of scenarios when you did want to turn quickly, you might not have a lot of speed. For example, in combat. During combat, you needed to be highly reactive, but could only deploy a small amount of sail in order to reduce the amount of crew needed to man the sails and thus free up more for combat, and also to increase visibility. The larger, lower sails would block your vision. This was mitigated by the fact that most ship duels occurred side by side, and fast, sudden turning maneuvers were uncommon. The helmsman would make more subtle turns in order to align the cannons with the enemy. A better scenario in which you needed turning capability, which you did not have, was in a port or harbor. When moving out or docking, you want to avoid other ships, smaller boats, and potential hazards. So you couldn't sail swiftly, but this also hampered your turning ability, if not removing it entirely. The solution was either to have the ship towed behind smaller boats, or even to use oars. Oars can also be used to turn a vessel effectively, by only rowing on one side. High speed allowed for special turning maneuvers. Club hauling involved dropping the anchor when at full sail in order to stop the ship and make her come about completely. In the first parts of the Caribbean movie, it is deployed during a chase, but it was most often used to avoid hazards. Box hauling is a similar maneuver. Tacking is a sailing maneuver in which you sail against the wind in a zigzag pattern, but sailing and battle maneuvers will have to be tackled in its own episode. Whilst the high speed was essential for the rudder to function, it also made it increasingly difficult to control, and could potentially lead to losing control or even the rudder breaking. The rudder breaking was one of the most dangerous things that could happen to a ship, as it would lead to a complete loss of control and potential wrecking or destruction. Therefore, the ship commander had to work in close conjunction with the helmsman, the man controlling the rudder. Specifically, he had to trim the sails appropriately with the wind. If the winds were weak, they might want to increase sail. If the wind was very powerful, a storm even, sails might have to be decreased so as to not overpower the rudder and helmsman. Rudders could be destroyed if the currents were too strong, usually in the case of a storm, but could also be caused by the rudder already being damaged, worn out, or weakly built. If you ran aground, there was a high chance of the rudder breaking, and for this reason, it was often attached to the ship via rope to prevent it from being lost. It could also be destroyed in combat, and this was one of the main goals of a sea battle, crippling the enemy ship as to make it unable to maneuver. It was done by destroying the sails and rig, or the rudder. The rudder could be targeted in multiple ways. Most straightforward was simply to target it with cannons. Double-headed shot were the most effective. Whilst it could be done by shooting at the enemy side by side, it was difficult to target the rudder specifically, since individual cannons could not be aimed sideways, and the rudder makes for a very small target, much of which is located below the waterline, and thus obscured. If the rudder was hit in a duel, it was mostly by chance. You were more likely to break the rudder if you bombarded the enemy from the back. But since this was the most susceptible part of any ship, commanders would do anything so as to not expose it. There were more subtle ways in which to disable or destroy the rudder. One was to wedge it. You would set a small gang in a canoe or rowboat and have them row astern of the enemy. Suppressing the stern with muskets, they would move close to the rudder and hammer wedges in between the rudder itself and the hinges connecting it to the stern post. This forced the rudder to stay stuck, preventing any form of movement and the helm from controlling it. A man had to be lowered, or a boat directed there in order to free the wedges. the rudder could also be destroyed by subtle sabotage. In 1679, a Chilean swam out on a balloon to the pirate ship of Captain Bartholomew Sharp, where he stuffed a mixture of oakum and brimstone between the rudder and stern post, sending it alight with a slow match. The strong smell invoked by the mixture alerted the crew, who discovered the ruse and put out the flames before it could have any effect. They managed to find the balloon and match on the shore, but never managed to catch the culprit. What an absolute mad lad. If the rudder had been destroyed in any way, it had to be repaired with whatever spare materials were available. In the best case, they might even have an entire spare rudder. Now, I've gone pretty far without even having discussed the construction of the rudder. Whilst you might imagine it as a simple board, the shape of the rudder was absolutely essential. The shape of the rudder was influenced by the lines of the run, meaning the shape of the boat's hull near the stern below the waterline. This part of the ship affected the flow of water, and thus the effect of the rudder. The traditional rudder was the broadest at its lowest point, since this is where the water escaping under the bottom of the ship struck it at the most advantageous angle. After the rudder itself had been constructed, it had to be mounted. Historically, there were essentially two types of rudder mountings: balanced and simple. Balanced rudders were common on Viking vessels, Chinese junks, and on various modern ships. They have their pivot point not at the edge of the rudder, but a bit inwards from it. This makes the rudder easier to turn, but it was impossible to place on ships in the age of pirates, and never seems to have been used in the period. Instead, all rudders appear to have been simple and hinged. This means that the forward edge of the rudder is fixed to the stern post via 4, 5, or 6 hinges, called pintos, fitted onto the gudgeons of the stern post. The stern post is a vertical beam jutting out of the ship's stern, rising directly from the keel. The top of the rudder was then connected to the helm, the device used for controlling the rudder. Let's take a look. Helm refers to the steering device, and seems to be an old word for handle or helve. Appropriately so, because the oldest type of helm was a literal lever, since called the tiller. It would remain the only type of helm up until the development of multi-decked ships in the late Middle Ages. Because you really didn't need anything else. The only thing you had to take into account was the length of the tiller in relation to the size of the ship. A longer lever allows you to exert more force with less effort, meaning that the bigger a ship was, the longer the tiller had to be, and the farther the helmsman handled it from the rudder. Longer tillers providing greater leverage was crucial for the easy and effective handling of a ship, but one still had to be cautious, since excessive movement of the tiller could increase drag and slow the vessel. Some vessels were mounted with multiple tillers. In the case of one small vessel, her first tiller, connected directly to the rudder, was made out of iron and ran through the captain's cabin. It was short and provided less leverage, but could be used if the deck above was under fire or during a storm, heavy rain, and the like. It was connected to a wooden tiller on the deck above, which was longer and had more leverage, but also exposed to enemy muskets and the elements. The bigger a ship became, the more difficult it was to use a tiller. You could make a tiller longer, that is, until it became too long. After about 8 or 10 feet, it became impossible to use, and since the tiller in a first rate was about 30 feet long, some other arrangement was necessary. One solution was to rig tackles and hook them to both sides of the tiller. A line then connected the tackles horizontally across the deck, creating a sort of triangle, and a single man could handle the horizontal line quite readily, at least in moderate weather. Still, this solution was far from perfect, and mariners soon looked for alternatives to the tiller. The solution came in the form of the whipstaff, the dominant steering mechanism of the Age of Sail and the Age of Pirates. The base of it consisted of a ring, through which you stuck the end of the tiller. The shaft then continued upwards and passed through a hole or pivot point in the ceiling or deck above, called a nut or roll. The staff was loosely fitted in the nut, so that it could be pushed sideways as well as up and down. In some cases, the whipstaff seems to have been fixed to a pivot, only allowing it to swing side by side, not up and down. From this upper deck, the helmsman could clasp the whipstaff, and by swinging the upper end to starboard and pushing the staff down to larboard, the rudder, and ship by proxy, would turn to larboard, or the opposite. Known as either the whipstaff, whip, or staff, the latter makes a lot of sense since it is a literal staff. The term whip embodies the idea of quick movement and reaction, whereas in Dutch it was simply known as the kolderstock, referring to the staff of a plough. The whip was a necessary invention for multi-decked ships, where the tiller became buried in the decks below the quarterdeck. On smaller vessels, the whip was typically found on the quarterdeck and exposed to the elements. In heavy weather or combat, it might then be necessary to disconnect the whip and steer from the tiller below deck. On larger vessels, the whip was typically located below the weather deck. The helmsman might be standing on an elevated platform and have vision of the deck above via a raised casing called the hutch, covering his head and shoulders. His view was still very limited, and the helmsman most often steered by the word of command and by the compass, which was placed in a binnacle before him. By swinging the whip to larboard or starboard, the rudder, and the ship by proxy, would turn in the opposite direction. This device allowed for easier, faster, and safer control of the tiller, but it also had a few disadvantages. It only allowed for limited control of the tiller. You couldn't push it farther than 15 degrees on either side, and there was a decrease in mechanical advantage when the helm was put hard over, turning the ship as far as possible in one direction, meaning that it was difficult to make very dramatic turns with the whip. The whip was highly dependent on good cooperation with the sails, appropriately trimming them to make good turns, and if it blew too hard, the whip had to be disconnected, and the return to the pure tiller necessary. Again, sailors had to find a better alternative. A possible one-of-a-kind helm is the steering windlass, which, as far as I know, has only ever been found on a ship model from Greenwich. This model is mysteriously undated, but has been traced to between the years 1702 and 1703. Despite its weirdness, it is remarkably simple, and seems to be a derivative of the tiller with tackles, rather than a descendant of the whip. The tiller had lines running to tackles on either side of it, and these lines then continued upwards to tackles on the deck or ceiling above it, on a similar position as the whip's roll. These lines would then wound several times around the axle of a windlass, and placed horizontally with the direction of the ship. By winding the crank on either side of the windlass, you'd think the ship would turn in that direction, like a modern steering wheel, but since sailors were used to the tiller, where turning the tiller in one direction would move the ship in the opposite, the ropes of the windlass were rigged so that it would work in the same way. So it worked the same way as the whip, though you could now exert greater control over the helm. The problem is that it only seems manageable by two persons, unless you'd constantly want to run between the two cranks, and I'm not sure how many times you would have to wind the cranks in order to effectively turn. The steering windlass does, however, seem to appear in William Sutherland's book from 1717, Shipbuilding Unveiled, in which it describes a ship having both a whipstaff and a steering windlass. Sutherland refers to this system as the wheel, meaning that there doesn't appear to have been any distinction in name between the windlass and the ship's wheel as we know it. Since there are so few archaeological remnants of steering mechanisms from the early 18th century, it is therefore unknown how common the steering windlass was in relation to the more well-known ship's wheel, and if the windlass was just a temporary experiment or actually quite common. I have to say that I'm absolutely captivated by this esoteric mechanism and just how unusual and unknown it is. The steering windlass seems to have appeared around the same time as the superior ship's wheel, which did not show up until as late as 1703, the final stage of the age of sail, and one of the big mysteries of maritime history is why this crucial and brilliant device was not pioneered earlier, considering the flaws of the whipstaff and problems with the tiller alone. When the wheel appeared, it became the dominant helm on all but the very smallest of vessels. The staff was becoming increasingly archaic, and seems to have disappeared around 1750. The staff was becoming increasingly archaic, and seems to have disappeared around 1750. Still, it seems to have been the norm to have large ships fitted both with a whipstaff and a steering wheel between 1703 and 1717, with the staff possibly being used in light conditions by a single man, and the wheel in hard weather to replace the tiller with tackles. Another theory is that the whip could have been used as a visual indicator for the position of the rudder. It is possible that the wheel is a direct descendant of the steering windlass, since it deployed the same system of lines and blocks. The exception was that the line was wound around an axle running vertically with the ship, 5.5 times specifically, and that you control it by a wheel, holding onto the spokes sticking out of it. By turning the wheel on one end, the rope was slacked off and the other pulled in. Thus the tiller was pulled to one side and the ship was steered. It functioned exactly like the windlass. If you spun the wheel in one direction, the ship turned to the opposite, just like a tiller. It is uncertain when, where, or who invented the wheel as we know it. By 1715, it had become common on English men-of-war. The Republic of Venice adopted it officially in 1719. It was such an effective steering mechanism that it became used on basically everything but rowboats. The only issue was that it was exposed, same as all helms. Therefore, many vessels were fitted with a steerage. This was a shielded section placed before the great cabin, but entirely open ahead, shielding the helm from the sides and above, protecting it from hard weather and enemy gunfire. Popular media often leaves the helm in the hands of the captain or other commanding officer. In reality, this officer was too busy for such an arduous task, and would instead give commands to the helmsman, known as conning. Every seaman of a watch, a work group, was expected to know how to steer and handle the helm, but in reality, the job was usually given to the most able person, especially in combat. He was a veteran seaman with an arbitrarily defined feel for the task at hand, and one who could, preferably, steer without the need of an officer conning him. This was especially vital in combat and pursuit, when the officer might be busy or even, decommissioned. The helmsman could be aided by a lee helmsman, who took the other side of the wheel. In bad weather, 2 more men might stand on either side of the 2 wheels. These lee helmsmen followed the movements of the weather helmsman, directing their total attention to him, and not watching the compass nor the sails. It was a demanding task. Casual conversation was forbidden, as it required the helmsman's complete attention, with a shift, or trick, usually lasting only an hour. Upon being relieved, he gave his relief the current order, such as steering full and by, carrying 3 spokes of weather helm. If the weather was bad and the helmsman still managed to cope, he might not be relieved, since he had the quote-unquote feel of the ship. By his side was an experienced petty officer who kept an eye on the wheel, supervised by the officer of the watch. This officer kept a check on the course being steered, how the helm was being carried, and so on. When the helmsman was to take his position, he relieved himself of his knife and other metal possessions, which might disrupt the magnetic power of the compass. When taking the wheel, he would always stand on the weather side, the one facing the wind, his inside hand holding an upper spoke, his outer a lower. A good helmsman was one who did not let the helm wander off course, and who used a so-called small helm, a spoke or 2 of the wheel, to predict and meet the movements of the ship, rather than going hard up or down, with the vessel yawing heavily. This was a skill and feel developed by experience, but also his own sensory feeling of the wind striking him. The officer of the watch would have to work in close conjunction with the helmsman, trimming the sails appropriately if too much helm was being carried. The ship could be steered by 2 means. If the wind was free and the ship lay her course, the helmsman would steer by compass. He'd be given the course to steer and steady the lubber's line on that point, a fixed reference mark on the compass. Since the compasses of the day were somewhat sluggish, he would also keep an eye on the ship's front in relation to the horizon. When unable to lay the course and forced to work to windward, the helmsman had to steer by the wind. The aim was to keep the ship up the wind as close as possible. The ideal was to keep the ship by the wind, but at the same time have the sails full and the ship footing along. In a good breeze, the helmsman watched the mainsail, the ends of which should be on the point of shivering. In a light breeze, he watched the topmost sails, going off when they started to shake. If the wind was very light, he could be guided by a pedant at the masthead. Instructions to the helmsman were given based on the position of the tiller, not of the rudder. Before the advent of the modern steering wheel, turning the helm to one side moved the ship in the opposite direction. So the classic command of hard a starboard does instead turn the ship to larboard. It wasn't until the late 19th and early 20th century that ships transitioned to giving the command based on the rudder instead of the helm. You might also note how I use the word larboard to describe the left side of the ship. Since the mid-19th century, it has officially been supplanted by port or port side to avoid confusion. But this was unofficially done since at least the early 17th century, at least by some sailors and maritime experts. The act of an officer instructing the helmsman was known as conning, and the commands largely didn't change throughout the centuries. It included orders like hard down, meaning that the helm was pushed as far as possible in the downwind direction. The given order was then, if necessary, repeated by the helmsman. Hard down, sir. Most of the orders can be divided into the categories of orders when sailing before the wind and orders when steering by the wind. The former includes such orders as to follow a particular compass course, like steer west-northwest. To alter the course to larboard, starboard, helm starboard, or starboard helm. When making a hard turn, give her more helm. To increase the helm already turning, hard over, and make the quickest possible swing. Steady, when headed in the desired direction. The quartermaster reported the course at the moment the order is given, and if satisfactory, the order keep her so. If the ship had gone a little to the right of the desired course, the order steady as starboard might have been given, upon which the helm was put a little to starboard, and then steady was given when the desired heading was reached. Meter was the order given when the vessel was swinging rapidly, nearing the desired heading, and it was necessary to slow the swing. Midships, helm amidships, right to helm, all meant to center the tiller. Shift to helm was the order to switch from starboard to port, as, for example, when starting to make sternway, sail backward. Nothing to westward, if the ship was being steered a little to the west of the desired course, and course west-northwest, nothing to westward, was cautioned that the ship must not be allowed to yaw in that direction, be pushed in that direction. Mind your starboard helm meant either a warning that starboard helm was necessary, or an indication that the ship was headed a little to the right of the desired direction, and that a little starboard helm was necessary to correct this. Steering by the wind meant sailing as closely against the wind as possible, without going dead into it. To take the ship off the wind, the conner gave the command of helm up, hard up, or let her go off, or let her go off handsomely. Helm down, hard down, let her come to handsomely, bring her down to wind, bring her to the wind, luff, let her luff, brings her into the wind. East down the helm was used primarily in tacking, sailing against the wind in a zigzag pattern. Luff and touch her was an order to bring the ship up very close to just shake the sails, and then go off again to the close hauled point. Close haul meaning sailing as closely against the wind as possible without losing sail power. No higher, earlier, no near, was given as the ship was brought to the wind, and the desired point had been reached. It would be followed by, very well thus, full and by, keep her a good full, let her go her course. Dice, no higher, or dice, nothing off, meant that the ship had reached the desired point of sail and was not to be luffed any further. Luffing meaning the fluttering of a sail. Luffing meaning the fluttering of a sail. Mind your steerage might be a comment on the helmsman's lack of focus, or a warning that the ship was nearing some difficult water in the channel, and extra diligence would be required. In combat, the most sturdy, experienced, and cool-headed man was elected to be helmsman. Aside from having to deploy the usual skill set of a helmsman, he additionally needed to work independently of the officer's conning, moving the ship in reaction and relation to the enemy. He was responsible for aligning the ship's side, and thus her cannons, with the enemy. He was therefore the one aiming the broadsides. Since he was such an essential member, he was a main target of enemy sharpshooters, along with the officer corps stationed on the quarterdeck. A good and accurate volley could wipe them all out, essentially crippling the ship and ending the battle in a single masterstroke. Pray tell, ladies and gentlemen, that it does not happen to us. If you enjoyed this episode and wish to see more deep dives into the methods in which pirates manage their ships, please let me know by giving this video a like and a comment sharing your thoughts. If there is enough interest, I will make a follow-up video talking about how they sail their ships. These videos are of course very niche and not always guaranteed to get the views they need to sustain me. So if you want to see the continued production of them, please make a one-time donation via PayPal or become a channel member or Patreon supporter. This way, you can also watch my videos without ads. All of the necessary links can be found in the video description. Enjoy.